Welcome to the Bhagavati channel. Today I'm going to continue my reading from the Song of Ribhu, a book much favoured by Muji Ramana. As there are no alphabets beginning with A, there is no language to converse with these. As there is no honoured guru, there is no enlightened disciple. As no variety of texts exist, there are no injunctions or prohibitions. Be certain that it is only the self, of the nature of undiminishing knowledge, that ever exists. As there is no individuality, duality there is none. As there is no duality, individuality there is none. As there is no afflicting fear, fearlessness there is none. As there is no compound word as fearlessness, fear there is none. As there is no evil, good there is none. Be certain that it is only the self, ever of the nature of knowledge, that ever exists. As there is no truth, untruth there is none. As there is no unwavering untruth, truth there is none. As there is no purity, impurity there is none. As there is nothing to speak of as impurity, purity there is none. As there is no pursuing misery, happiness there is none. As there is no following happiness, misery, there is none. Be certain that it is only the Self, with no trace of duality that ever exists. As there is never you, there is also no I. As there is no I who has spoken, there is no you either. As there is no doer, action there is none. There being no action, doer there is none. As there is none of the nature of devotee, liberated, there is none. As there is none to be called liberated, devotee, there is none. Be certain that it is only the Self, with no trace of duality, that exists changelessly. As there is nothing of the nature of birth, death, there is none. As there is nothing of the nature of death, birth, there is none. As there is nothing that is of the nature that is separate, there is no I. As there is nothing of the nature of the I, there is nothing separate. As there is nothing of the nature of the mind, delusion, there is none. As there is nothing as the nature of delusion, mind, there is none. Be certain that it is only the Self, perfectly full as the mass of knowledge that exists changelessly. As there is nothing of the nature of end, beginning there is none. As there is nothing of the nature of beginning, end, there is none. As there is nothing of the nature of the pairs of opposites, objects of perception, there are none. As there is nothing of the nature of objects of perception, opposing pairs, there are none. As there is nothing of the nature of bondage, liberation, there is none. As there is nothing of the nature of liberation, bondage, there is none. Be certain that it is only the self, ever of the nature of consciousness, that exists changelessly. As there is nothing that can be spoken of as the effect, there is no cause that can be ascribed. As there exists nothing manifest as the seen, there is no seer to see. As there is no variety of duality of any kind, there is no changeless non-duality. Be certain that it is only the self, the all-complete, that is imperishable. As there is no object that is internal, there is no object to be spoken of as external. As there is nothing that is to be called all, there is nothing to be described as a little part. As there is nothing that is not vibrant, there is nothing that is static. Be certain that it is only the self, the all-pervasive mass of consciousness, that is without any defect. There is nothing to be pointed out as this or that, and nothing to be described as non-existent or existent. There is nothing that proves itself permanent. There are no examples or similes. There are no entities that manifest themselves in their manifoldness. There are no such things as the wondrous world the jivas, and the Supreme. All this is ever the undivided Supreme Brahman. It is the unsullied Supreme Brahman, indeed, that is the Self. What appears as all is only Brahman. What appears as you is only Brahman. What appears as me is only Brahman. What appears as others is only Brahman. What appears faulty as the world is only Brahman. What appears as the Lord Ishvara is only Brahman. Appearances of all kinds are only Brahman. It is the undivided Supreme Brahman that is the Self. The nature of the Self is a mass of truth consciousness bliss. The nature of the Self is a complete, full perfection, all. The nature of the Self is the eternal and the attributeless. The nature of the Self is partless and untainted. The nature of the Self is the pure space of consciousness. The nature of the Self is the subtlest of the subtle. The nature of the Self is the non-dual reality. The nature of the Self is one undivided essence. Therefore, there is not an atom separate from the Self, the one undivided essence. You are that Self, which is a mass of knowledge. There is not an iota of doubt in this declaration. Sage of supreme tapas, you will be liberated from the bondage of worldly misery. By reaching the differenceless, undivided certitude of the Self, that I, the Self, am ever of the nature of the exalted Supreme Brahman. Thus, for the good of all, have I briefly described to you, Nidaga, the definition of the non-dual indivisible self. Namaste Shanti. Thus, for the good of all, have I briefly described to you, Nidaga, the definition of the non-dual, indivisible self, in the way in which the Lord Ishvara, whose greatness has no end, earlier graced me with this knowledge. Those who listen carefully and steadfastly learn at least once, with a pure heart, this ascertainment of the self, will attain the state of the perfectly full Supreme Brahman. The next section is titled One's Own Experience. Thus spoke the sage Ribhu. Joyously addressing him, Nidaga sincerely requested, "My true Guru, please rid me of all mundane miseries by graciously telling me now the wonderful, personal, beatific experience that you had at that time on Mount Kailash by the grace of Shiva." The sage answered him thus, "I am, indeed, Brahman, of the nature of truth, knowledge, bliss. I am, indeed, Brahman, without any connection to samsara. I am, indeed, Brahman, which is eternal and partless. I am, indeed, Supreme Brahman, without form. I am, indeed, Supreme Brahman, which is the essential and the exclusive. I am, indeed, the Supreme Brahman, which stands by itself. I am, indeed, the Supreme Brahman, which is non-dual. I am, indeed, Brahman, which is whole, perfectly full, and undivided. I am, indeed, Supreme Brahman, which stands as the nature of truth. I am, indeed, Supreme Brahman, which is ever in bliss. I am, indeed, Supreme Brahman, which is of the nature of consciousness. I am, indeed, Supreme Brahman, which is the space of consciousness. I am, indeed, Supreme Brahman, which is blemishless. I am, indeed, Supreme Brahman, which is untainted. I am, indeed, Supreme Brahman, which is of the nature of myself. I am, indeed, the one perfectly full Brahman. I am, indeed, Supreme Brahman with no caste or clan. I am, indeed, Supreme Brahman, which has discarded all associations. I am, indeed, Supreme Brahman, without beginning or end. I am indeed Supreme Brahman, which has discarded all that is meaningless. I am indeed Supreme Brahman, without sorrow. I am indeed Supreme Brahman, which is magnificent. I am indeed Supreme Brahman, devoid of differences. I am indeed Supreme Brahman, devoid of attachments. I am indeed Brahman, which cannot be indicated as this. I am indeed Brahman, which cannot be indicated as I. I am indeed Brahman, which cannot be pointed to as that. I am indeed Brahman, which has nothing separate from itself. I am indeed Brahman, which cannot be said to be rooted in anything. I am indeed Brahman, which has no objects to see. I am indeed Brahman, which is of the same nature all of the time. I am indeed the Supreme Brahman, which stands immutable. I am indeed the Supreme Brahman, which is absolutely eternal. I am indeed the Supreme Brahman, which is absolutely pure. I am indeed the Supreme Brahman, which is absolute knowledge. I am indeed the Supreme Brahman, which is absolute liberation. I am indeed the Supreme Brahman, which is absolutely blemishless. I am indeed the Supreme Brahman, which is absolutely without connections. I am indeed the Supreme Brahman, which is absolutely without movement. I am indeed the Supreme Brahman, which is absolutely divisionless. I am indeed Brahman, which is the mass of absolute truth. I am indeed Brahman, which is the mass of absolute consciousness. I am indeed Brahman, which is the mass of absolute bliss. I am indeed Brahman, which is absolutely subtle. I am indeed Brahman, which is absolutely pure. I am indeed Brahman, which is absolute auspiciousness. I am indeed Brahman, which is absolutely eternal. I am indeed Brahman, which is absolute peace. I am indeed the Supreme Brahman, which is exclusively of the nature of existence. I am indeed the Supreme Brahman, which is exclusively of the nature of consciousness. I am indeed the Supreme Brahman, which is exclusively of the nature of good. I am indeed the Supreme Brahman, which is exclusively of the nature of sound. I am indeed the Supreme Brahman, which is exclusively of the nature of space. I am indeed the Supreme Brahman, which is exclusively of the nature of that which alone is. I am indeed Brahman, which alone is of this exclusive nature. I am indeed the Supreme Brahman, which is simple magnificence. I am indeed Brahman, which does not change into parts. I am indeed Brahman, which transcends all fragmentation. I am indeed Brahman, which has not a speck of mind. I am indeed Brahman, which has no sankalpa, concept, or vikalpa, doubt or differentiation. I am indeed Brahman, without manifold names. I am indeed Brahman, without any diversified forms. I am indeed the Immaculate Supreme Brahman, untouched by an ego. I am indeed the Supreme Brahman, which is the undivided space of consciousness. And I'd like to finish with a few minutes of silence, and then to finish this session a little early today so that we can set up for satsang with Muji. Let's sit a moment. Thank you for listening. Om Shanti, 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 Om. Muji ji, ki jai. Ananta ji, ki jai. Thank you, beloveds.